Putin is a master manipulator. He's known for making statements such as claiming that Russia is not responsible for the war in Ukraine and suggesting that both countries are sharing in the tragedy and the Russian public is buying it. What other lies is he spreading, and how is he managing to persuade more than 145 million Russian citizens to buy into his claims? One of the biggest lies Putin is guilty of is the way he plays fast and loose with the term genocide, especially when it comes to describing the Ukrainian military operations that took place in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, collectively known as the Donbass, leading up to the invasion. According to Putin, the primary objective of the war in Ukraine has always been the demilitarization and denazification of the Ukrainian government. Ultimately, to put a stop to the genocide he claims Kyiv has been carrying out against the Russian-speaking population of the Donbass. But is a genocide actually happening? According to the UN, genocide is defined as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As such, this definition includes not only mass murder but the destruction of a specific population's way of life. Examples of this include permanently separating young children from their parents and making attempts to stop new members from being born into the population. To be clear, both Ukrainian and pro-Russian forces were guilty at the time of inflicting collateral damage, namely deaths or injuries from reckless, accidental, or indiscriminate firing. But it's imperative to make a clear distinction here between collateral damage resulting from armed conflict and genocide, and this is where Putin strays from the truth. Starting in 2014, the Ukrainian army has been in constant conflict with Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass, ever since Russian-backed rebels seized part of the region and declared it the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Nearly 14,000 people were killed in the skirmish, including soldiers, civilians, and rebel fighters. A ceasefire was promptly signed in 2015 in the Belarusian capital of Minsk, but sporadic gunfire and shelling continued to disrupt the region for the next 7 years, until February 2022, when Russian troops moved over the border, effectively kicking off Putin's peacekeeping operation, which has since spread across most of Ukraine. To strengthen his argument for war, and prior to actually entering Ukraine, Russia's investigative committee filed a lawsuit with the European Court of Human Rights back in 2021, concerning alleged war crimes committed by the Ukrainian army and certain nationalist battalions. The lawsuit claimed that members of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics discovered a mass grave containing 292 bodies, victims of Putin's supposed genocide. The committee also claimed that Ukraine and the United States were working together to develop biological and chemical weapons they intended to use against separatist forces in the Donbass. Ultimately, no credible evidence to back these claims was presented, only vague references to other mass graves and ongoing attacks directed at Russian-speaking civilians. But the Russians haven't been the only ones looking to our international legal system for assistance. 7 months after the invasion, on September 27, 2023, representatives from Kyiv effectively turned the table on Putin and urged judges at the International Court of Justice, also known as the ICJ or World Court, to go against objections put forth by the Kremlin and hear Kyiv's testimony that Moscow violated international law when they claimed the 2022 invasion was carried out to stop an alleged genocide. As one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, the ICJ is responsible for settling disputes between states in accordance with international law and gives advisory opinions on international legal issues. Claiming that Russia violated international law as outlined in the 1948 Genocide Convention, representatives from Kyiv have continued to seek the ICJ's protection, while Russia, on the other hand, has so far ignored the ICJ's preliminary hearing, handed down in March of 2022, which ordered a stop to all military actions. The World Court, however, has no way of enforcing this ruling. Experts do say, though, that a full ruling in Ukraine's favor, that is, if the ICJ agrees that Russia essentially carried out a false flag operation and launched their invasion under the guise of preventing further genocide, this could result in future financial compensation for Ukraine. But Putin crying genocide isn't the biggest lie he's told to justify going to war with Ukraine. During the ongoing action at the World Court, the Kremlin actually accused Zelensky, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, of being a Nazi. It should probably be noted here that Zelensky's 5-year term as president began in 2019, with a landslide major victory over 39 other candidates, and that his Servant of the People party went on to win 254 seats in the 450-seat chamber, becoming the first majority government in the history of the modern Ukrainian state. It probably also would not hurt to mention that Ukraine today maintains a vibrant democracy, and for a brief period was the only state outside of Israel to have both a Jewish head of state and a Jewish head of government. Not to mention that Zelensky himself is the grandson of a Holocaust survivor and was raised in a Jewish family. While Putin is definitely the one responsible for making these verifiably false claims of genocide and neo-Nazism, unfortunately, in some ways Ukraine's own government has helped to spread them by the adoption of a new state language law that requires Ukrainian to be used in most aspects of public life. That may sound crazy, but allow us to explain. Article 25 of the new law, which was actually put in place by former President Petro Poroshenko back in 2019 as he was leaving office, requires that print media outlets registered in Ukraine publish in Ukrainian, that publications in other languages be accompanied by an equivalent Ukrainian version, and that at least half of all content provided by distribution outlets, such as newsstands, be in Ukrainian. There are some exceptions carved out for certain languages like English and official EU languages, but not for Russian. So how does this further Putin's lies? The implementation of these new laws has been, to varying degrees, upsetting for Ukraine's Russian-speaking population, and some see this as real-world evidence that helps support Putin's more outlandish claims. Historians have pointed out, however, that Russian speakers currently living in Ukraine have far more freedom than they could expect were they living in Russia, where, among manifestations of state oppression, any form of political dissent is swiftly suppressed. This all makes the labeling Zelensky and his party as Nazis quite the stretch, especially when we take into consideration Putin's recent anti-Semitic rant on Russian television. Western powers, Putin said, only installed Zelensky as the president of modern Ukraine to cover up the current glorification of Nazism that's happening there. During his rant, Putin also made several arguably derogatory references to Zelensky's Jewish heritage, a somewhat regular occurrence since the launch of the invasion. But Ukraine's state language law isn't the only self-imposed problem they're facing. Complicating the entire issue significantly, however, and only serving to amplify Putin's cries of Nazism within the Ukrainian government, has been the ongoing controversy surrounding Ukraine's use of the so-called Azov Battalion. While the Azov Battalion does represent only a tiny fraction of Ukraine's defense forces, around 900 combatants, members of the battalion have been known to wear black fatigues, display Nazi tattoos, and go into battle with hand-drawn swastikas on their helmets. Further complicating the matter, largely due to their success in battle, the battalion was officially absorbed into the Ukrainian National Guard in November of 2014. Former President Poroshenko even called them some of Ukraine's best warriors and best volunteers. Coming to their own defense, the battalion insisted that the symbol they fought under is simply an N and an I, which stands for National Idea, while in actuality the symbol is clearly a tilted version of the Wolfsangel, borrowed from the Third Reich's 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The Azov Battalion's choice of insignia, unfortunately, is not the most controversial thing about them. They have been accused by no less than the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights of engaging in various war crimes, including torture, looting, and unlawful detention of civilians. In the wake of these and other disturbing accusations, they were removed from serving on the front lines in August 2015, while ongoing concerns in the United States prompted House Democrats to petition for the battalion to be classified as a foreign terrorist organization. Clearly, anything and everything to do with the Azov Battalion looks bad for Ukraine, but the organization's existence and contribution to the fight against Russian separatists, which ended years prior to the Russian invasion, doesn't justify a single one of Putin's claims, especially those related to Ukraine's right to exist at all as an independent country. But we haven't even gotten to some of Putin's biggest lies of all yet. During his address to the nation back in February 2022, Putin explicitly denied the validity of Ukraine's long-established statehood, claiming that modern Ukraine is actually a Soviet republic that was carved from Russian land by Vladimir Lenin, then supplemented with more land by Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. After a referendum in 1991, during which 92.3% of voters said they prefer Ukraine to be independent rather than remaining tied to the collapsing Soviet Union, the country achieved its independence, a breakup Putin took poorly and would much later describe as worse than a mistake. According to many Western analysts, however, Putin's revisionist history of Ukraine is an obvious mischaracterization, if not an outright lie. intended solely to justify his more recent aggressive actions. Many Ukrainians, too, have been happy to point out that Kyiv, with its own distinct language and customs, was founded hundreds of years before Moscow, and that a strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism has been alive and well for at least the last century, a sense that has only been inflamed by Putin's attempt to delegitimize their claim as a sovereign nation. In fact, the majority of Ukrainians have been less than enchanted with Russia for some time now, at least according to a public opinion survey conducted in November of 2021. According to the survey, which included all of Ukraine save for the occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, 58% of Ukrainians stated that they would rather join an international economic union with the EU if they could only join one, compared to just 21% who were in favor of joining a customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And if a referendum were held on potentially joining NATO, the majority of Ukrainians also stated they would opt to join. Ultimately, it looks as though Putin's fiery State of the Nation address, along with his other more recent, yet less intelligible tirades, may have failed to convince Ukrainians of the benefits of Moscow's patronage, and instead revealed the Russian president to a broader international community as the bully many of Russia's neighboring nations have already come to know. Even more recently, the Kremlin, in an act of seeming desperation, perhaps frustrated by Ukraine's hesitancy to come back into the fold, appears to have adopted the age-old strategy of blame it on the nukes. During a Geneva conference on disarmament in March of 2022, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed that Ukraine had been seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, and that this was a real danger to neighboring countries, as well as a threat to international security that required Russia to respond. This argument appears to be at best quite thin, especially given that Ukraine was once the third largest nuclear power in the world, but instead opted for total denuclearization. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, thousands of nuclear arms were left behind by Moscow, but instead of holding onto their impressive stockpile, Ukraine made the decision to go nuke-free, and in exchange for their kind consideration of global nuclear safety, with the signing of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, the US, UK, and Russia all agreed to guarantee Ukraine's security. However, now that they are under attack, it seems to be up to the international community, especially the signers of the Budapest Memorandum, to keep Ukraine from regretting that decision. In times like these, one could argue, it's important to keep your friends close. Which could be why, after they'd been asking for months, President Biden finally decided to supply Ukraine with long-range Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS. Fired from a mobile launcher, a missile from an ATACMS can hit a target up to 300 kilometers away, which should allow Ukrainian forces to strike far behind the front lines, an invaluable advantage as winter approaches and troop movements become increasingly difficult. With a limited stockpile of their own, though, and mounting concerns that Russia might go on to accuse Washington of purposefully escalating the conflict, the US held out on handing over these highly valuable weapon systems for as long as it could. As part of the deal, though, Ukraine had to promise not to launch attacks on Russian territory, leaving potential targets for the new missile systems limited to command headquarters, weapons depots, railways, and other supply networks inside Ukraine. With casualties mounting on both sides and the overall advantage shifting back and forth, it's certainly been a long half year for Ukrainians and Russians alike. So we need to ask, how did we get here? Long ago, back in December of 2021, when 100,000 Russian troops were merely advancing toward the Ukrainian border, Putin sent the United States a list of demands that would absolutely need to be met in order to defuse the situation. Among them was a binding agreement that Ukraine would never be allowed to become a member of NATO. He also wanted all NATO troops and weapons removed from the 14 Eastern European countries that had joined the alliance since 1997. Ultimately, his demands were not met, but it could certainly also be said that Putin's long, distrustful history with NATO is partially responsible for the situation we're in now. There seems to be a lingering belief in Moscow that the West tricked the former Soviet Union by breaking promises made in 1989 and 1990 at the end of the Cold War, prompting Putin to accuse the West of going back on its assurances that NATO would not expand to the east, ultimately shattering this alleged agreement. The agreement Putin is referring to was largely based on verbal commitments made by former US Secretary of State James Baker, serving under former President George H.W. Bush, as well as a treaty signed on September 12, 1990, that outlined restrictions on NATO troop operations in the territory that makes up former East Germany. Putin has claimed that Secretary Baker, in a discussion on February 9, 1990, with infamous Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, promised that if Russia accepted Germany's unification, NATO would not expand to the east. The final agreement, however, that was actually signed by Russia and the US later that year in September, only applied to Germany, and stated only that the NATO troops would be allowed to cross the old Cold War line marked by East Germany, and only at the discretion of the German government. 6 years later, in 1997, when it came to sign the NATO-Russia Founding Act, a treaty intended to finally establish a relationship between the alliance and Russia, Russia's Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov again raised the issue of Secretary Baker's empty promises. It didn't help matters either that despite Russia presenting itself throughout the process as a potential NATO member, the US never saw this as a reality but only a fantasy. Washington concluded without directly saying so that had the potential to paralyze the alliance. At the time, Russia's economy and political landscape were in a shambles, which led their wavering openness to NATO's expansion to teeter back and forth, depending largely on the level of financial support provided by the US or Germany. Monetary contributions that typically went missing as soon as they were transferred, but neither Russia, the US nor Germany ever described as bribes. In the decades to follow, Putin has claimed that the West has continued to ignore Russia's adamant demands that NATO, 1. Not extend their reach to Ukraine or any other ex-Soviet nation, 2. Not deploy any offensive weapons near Russia, and 3. Scale back its overall presence in Eastern Europe. And Putin, at least in terms of NATO's ongoing expansion, isn't wrong. Currently, there are American and British military advisors serving in Ukraine. There are US missile defense systems located in both Poland and Romania, and NATO troops continue to conduct exercises in the former Soviet Union countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Putin has said a great many things, making it difficult to discern what might be anything other than fiery gibberish, but he did warn the West that if his demands were ignored, he would consider it a violation of their obligation to ensure the security of all nations. He did warn that if Ukraine moved to join NATO, he would grow deeply concerned about the possibility of Ukraine mobilizing to take back control of the Russian-annexed Crimean Peninsula, as well as regions in the east controlled by Russia-backed separatists. Putin also claimed, however, that the US was asking Ukraine to contain Russia and draw the country into a military conflict, which would then force its European allies to respond, primarily through sanctions. And if that didn't work, the US would try to tempt Ukraine into joining NATO, so it could deploy offensive weapons near the Russian border. Then the US would encourage Ukrainian nationalists to forcefully reclaim the Crimea and rebel-held regions in the east, giving the Kremlin no choice but to defend itself. It's clear that we're now living in an age where misinformation can be weaponized, and that purposefully generating and spreading false or misleading information can not only harm individuals but ruin companies, disrupt economies, destabilize nations, and even lead to an all-out war. Putin's continued efforts to mislead both the Russian people and wider international community have resulted in a war in Ukraine. But as time goes on, and his claims become more and more untethered from reality, perhaps a time will come when even the most pro-Putin supporter will be left to wonder whether the Russian president is telling them the whole truth. But what do you think? How harmful are Putin's lies? And how long will he manage to keep the Russian public fooled? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.